Welcome to episode 30 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. In this episode's main segment, I'm going to be talking with screenwriter Joe Gazzam. Joe has recently worked on several high-profile studio projects, including the Barbarella remake, the Cliffhanger reboot, and 21 Jump Street. He's also sold several studio-level spec scripts, and we go into some of the real details about how he did this, so stay tuned for that. I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, Screencraft. Screencraft is dedicated to helping screenwriters master the craft of screenwriting and succeed in the business of Hollywood. Sign up for free education inspiration at screencraft.org. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread the word about the podcast. I want to improve this podcast, so some honest, constructive feedback is very much appreciated. I'd like to thank Stanford Crane, John Kelmer, Rod Wilson, Sean Speak, Jason Levy, Alan Hart, KT, and the Tofu Princess, who all left me very nice comments over at YouTube. Thanks to Diana Murdoch and VT for tweeting about episode 28. Thank you guys for that. A couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mentioned in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts. Also, if you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide, how to write a professional logline inquiry letter, how to find an agent, manager, or producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know about how to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. A quick few words about what I'm working on. I have had a couple of small developments with some of my scripts, but nothing really that big. I've been talking with a producer about an idea he has. I did a quick treatment. He had kind of a very rough treatment written out, and I expanded on that a little bit and gave it back to him, and he's taking it to some of his investors. I've been talking about maybe rewriting something with a director I know. This is a director who optioned something from me a while back, and we've just kind of built up a friendship, so we're kind of trying to figure out if there's not something we could do together. So just some little things. Hopefully something will materialize from this. I'm trying to finish up my low-budget sci-fi thriller script by the middle of August. Right now, I'm on pace to do that. I sort of go back and forth on this one, whether I like it or not, but we'll see when it's done. I'm doing a full read in my writers group on August 12th, so hopefully I'll get some good notes from that, and then I'll do a quick last pass on it, and then I'll start sending it out. So now let's get into the main segment. This week, I'm interviewing Joe Gazzam. Again, he's a screenwriter. He's had a bunch of spec sales in the last few years and done a bunch of studio-level writing assignments, and he gets into great detail in the interview in this. So here's the interview. Welcome, Joe, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
No, thanks for having me, man.
So to start out, I wonder if you can give us a quick overview of your career in the entertainment industry.
Yeah, I grew up in Florida, had no idea what I wanted to do, and no one I knew was in the entertainment industry, so I ended up going to college and just sort of wandering around, and then I graduated, and then just got into a series of just god-awful jobs, like, men's store manager and not at a cool store at Sears, and then like claims adjuster, and really it just sort of came to me in an epiphany, because I was always a movie freak and I always loved to write. It just never dawned on me. But I remember the exact moment I wanted to become a screenwriter, because I was in Sears and I was getting screamed at by the district manager for misaligning the underwear rack. And I was just sitting there thinking, my God, what have I done with my life? And I literally walked from there up to the appliances or sort of the computer place, grabbed a laptop, grabbed a briefcase, and then I went into my office and I faced my chair toward the door, tiny little office, put my briefcase on my lap, put the laptop in the briefcase, and opened it up toward the door so that if anyone came in, it would look like I was digging around my briefcase. and just pounded out my first script.
All that same day.
The same day I started. And then I just went out and bought a bunch of books. You know, I did the whole thing, reading a bunch of scripts, and I had really just one script that I had, and it was total Tarantino, Coen Brothers ripoff. But I just knew, I just had so much fun doing it. I knew that's what I wanted to do. So as the complete cliche, I took that one script, hopped in the car, packed all my things, and moved out to California. Didn't know anyone, had never even visited California. I was just possessed at that point, and came out here and really wrote what was my first real spec, which was called Scared Straight. That got me a manager who, in turn, you know, shopped it to, or not shopped it, but put it around to some agents, and that got me ICM at the time. And that actually went to New Line, and it got on the blacklist, so I got a little bit of heat, and that got me the assignment to write 21 Jump Street, which did really well, sort of went viral around town, and I started getting a little more heat. And then I just started going, at that point I wrote another spec that went to New Regency called Straight and Narrow. And then really it was just a bunch of series of jobs at that point. It was, I did a Fox animation thing. I did Barbarella, excuse me, and just sort of was going from job to job to job. And then that sort of, probably about a year ago, I just had the second epiphany, which was I just wasn't elevating my career. I was just sort of, that's sort of the trap of assignments, which is you get in and you get a quote. And then every single job you get after that, they just go, okay, we'll give you that same quote. Maybe they give you a few dollars more. So money-wise, you're not elevating. And then because you're sort of invisible to the rest of the town, you're only working with a few people because you're only doing, you know, a couple assignments a year maybe. So I was invisible to the rest of the town for a good 4 years maybe. And two, I was just sort of subsisting, and, you know, I was paying the bills, and believe me, I can't complain, but my career wasn't going up. So I just dropped everything and decided to write another spec, and that was a spec I just sold called Shadowrun over at Sony, and that just sort of spun everything up again. So now, like, Neil Moritz, who I was working with, loved it, and we had a great time working together, so he basically gave me cliffhanger. You know, normally you're pitching, it's a cattle call, you've got a million people you're up against, you got to work out every beat of the story, it's this whole thing, whereas now because of the spec and the heat that I was getting, I was literally, you know, pretty much handed an assignment. So it started sort of the upward climb again, which is, you know, sort of, you know, the attention of it all. But yeah, that's sort of where I find myself now.
Let's dig into that story. I'm curious. You hear a lot of, especially very well-established screenwriters, they kind of poo-poo a lot of the screenwriting books. You said you read some of those. Are there any screenwriting how-to books that you would recommend that new writers read?
You know, it's funny. I'm not even sure I could, besides, you know, Sid Field and a couple of the basics, I can't even remember. I just went through a tear, and this was, you know, 10 years ago or 8, 9 years ago. So nothing off the top of my head. I mean, honestly, some of it was just, you know, books where it was sort of success stories, or it would be just stories interviewing screenwriters. And for some reason that always got me jazzed up and was sort of inspirational. So even more than the rules and this and that, it was just hearing people that had made it and thinking that when I was in Florida and Atlanta that the dream was possible, you know. So that was really more than anything what the books did for me, is just sort of made me believe it was possible.
Yeah, yeah. And so what screenplays? You also said you read a bunch of screenplays. Are there some really good screenplays that you would recommend new writers read?
You know, I can tell you sort of a few of my favorites that really, you know, blew me away at the time. It was American Beauty, which I think is pretty much perfect. Seven, which I think is pretty much perfect in a lot of ways. Silence of the Lambs, and then, there's so many. I mean, Witness for structure. there's just a ton of good ones. But those were really, and then of course just for the flash of it and sort of the creativity, I went through my whole Tarantino phase and the Coen brothers, which, I was saying in the beginning, I sort of went through all their scripts. But yeah, just sort of just devouring as many as I could.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about Scared Straight. So you came out to Hollywood, and then after a while you wrote the Scared Straight. What number script was that? Like, how many scripts had you completed by the time you wrote Scared Straight?
That was my second. Because I had that one sort of that I came out with that, no one was ever going to make. And then, I had, that was pretty much my second, attempt at a spec.
And how good, looking back on it now, what do you think of Scared Straight? Do you still think it holds up? And
I do. I mean, it's funny because it's pretty grounded and it's pretty structured. I think I lucked into a lot of good things. Like there's other scripts I look back on and go, oh my God, what was that? Especially my first one, it was just practically, unreadable. But Scared Straight I've always loved, and I still sort of hold hope that, someone will make that, because it's just sort of a contained, set in a prison, and it was a pretty basic script too, so there wasn't a lot of ways to go wrong. It was sort of, in a lot of ways, just sort of get the guy out of the prison that gets taken over, and it still holds up really well, I think.
Okay. So what you mentioned too that you had loved movies and you had done some writing but not screenwriting. What type of writing did you do? Journalism, or what writing were you doing at this point, this early stages?
The funny thing is, it was really, I would write a lot of short stories, but they all involved characters that were my friends, and it was basically just raging on them and putting them in preposterous scenarios. And then spreading it around all my friends. And I remember, before that epiphany at SYS, I remember one guy coming up to me and saying, dude, you're just a frustrated writer. Why don't you do that? And it never even occurred to me, you can make a living at it. But yeah, it was really just me having fun at the expense of my friends, to be honest with you.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these assignments that you've got. You just mentioned like the cliffhanger one. You feel very fortunate that you were able to kind of just get that without going through the pitch sessions.
Right.
Let's talk about some of those pitch sessions and what those are like. And it seems like you've successfully won some of those pitching jobs. So maybe you can even give us some tips for writers that are, in that early stages of their career where they're going in and they're in this sort of round robin, pitching against other writers. Are there some tips that maybe you have? First, let's start with the process. Maybe just explain sort of what the process is like from your perspective.
Yeah, though, a lot of times there either be sort of a nugget, like a producer will say, we've got this little nugget and we've written up like one page where we think it might be, and we want to hear a bunch of takes. So that might be just sort of off from scratch. Then there's other assignments that are rewrites, and normally if you're getting sent something to rewrite, at least at the level I was at the time, it's probably going to be a page one sort of disaster. So in my case, you're almost always starting from scratch. At least I was. So it's really, and a lot of times they're burnt out on whatever the project is. So one thing I learned is almost never tell them how to fix what they have. Like, I've tried that a couple times and they just don't want to hear it. They want you to completely re-energize them. They want you to have a whole new spin on it, a whole new, something to get them going again. So that's one thing I learned early on. Another thing is keep it short. I keep all my pitches around 15 minutes. In fact, I've sort of worked it out to a number count. I can't remember what it is now. I have it written down somewhere, but where I know that, I write it out verbatim, and I memorize it. That way, I'm not floating in the room or I'm not reading off anything. By the time I get in there, I have the whole pitch sort of memorized, and that way, if they do throw me a curveball, that I can wing, but I can always go back to the sort of chronology of the story I'm trying to tell. So,
And maybe you can describe that pitch that you memorized, that 15-minute pitch. Is it the story beats, the act breaks, the character development? What's sort of in that? Maybe some tips on that, on how to develop that 15-minute pitch.
Yeah, well, the first thing is the person that's going to ultimately say yes to a pitch, or even a spec for that matter, is almost never going to read your spec, and he's almost never going to be in the room, when you're pitching. So the first thing is to have a hook. It's almost like you need a log line for your pitch, which seems preposterous because you're already pitching on a project that should have a log line, but you want to sort of give them something that they can walk into their boss's office and say, here's his take and here's what it is. It's, a mechanical spider on Mars, whatever it is, something that they can spit out. So that's number one. And after that, it's really keeping the macro points. At least from my point of view, it's, the basics, turning points, midpoints, climax, getting into the character and his sort of character arc, just sort of the macro stuff, because that's really all they care about at this point. The more, if you keep them to meandering and getting super detailed, they just don't have time for it. They're hearing, execs, all they do is meet all day long, like meeting, pitch meeting, generals. So, I go into one of those things and I'm exhausted after one of them. I can't imagine doing that all day. So their attention span's going to be tested. So it's get in there, creatively punch them in the face and then dive out the window as quickly as you can. It's been my motto.
Did someone did your agent help you develop this strategy of being 15 minutes, or did some other writers tell it to you, or it's just trial and error? You found that's what worked?
It's some of it's trial and error. I have talked to a few screenwriters, and that's sort of the range they like to stay in too. But you can also tell when, your pitch audience is drifting, and it always seems to be right around that, 20 minute mark is what I've found. Maybe I'm not nearly as engaging as I think I am, and that's when, people drift. But that's sort of what I found works for me. So.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about some of these sort of existing franchise. I won't even say existing franchise, but like 21 Jump Street, Barbarella. I mean, these are, kind of remakes and reimaginings. How do you kind of prepare for something like that? I vaguely remember 21 Jump Street as a TV show. I guess I've heard of Barbarella, but these are not things that I was familiar with, and I assume you probably were not either. Did you rent them? Do you have like a new angle, a modern take? How do you prepare for something like that?
Well, so for Jump Street, they sent me sort of all the DVDs, so I caught up. Although I remember seeing reruns as a kid, and was sort of into it at the time, but they were looking for sort of a modern take, and so they did have an existing script by, I'm blanking on their names now, but they just wrote the last Mission Impossible, The Ghost Protocol, but really good writers. Like, one of the best scripts I've ever been sent to rewrite. The problem was they had just come off of Alias, so it was very sort of Alias-ish, and it was set around like a supercomputer and stuff that, to me, didn't, and to original didn't make as much sense to be involved in high school. So my sort of thing was to go in with the drugs and sort of take a different path, which ended up, rewriting most, if not all, the script. So that's sort of what I pitched them, and they just sort of dug it, and I was on my way. And then in Barbarella, I met with Dino De Laurentiis, which was pretty cool, but he called me in. At first, he's like, yeah, we just want to meet you, and we have Barbarella, and they were looking for a dialogue polish. And so I went in there, and I went into this big, giant mansion, and he sits me down, and he's like, here's a script, go upstairs into a room and read it. And I'm like, all right. So I walked up there, and I read it, and I came back down. He's like, what'd you think? I'm like, as politely as I could, I said I didn't find much in there that was usable. And he's like, well, what would you do? And I literally just had to sort of off the cuff sort of tell him what I would do. And something luckily came to me, and he said, okay, go off and come back in 2 days and give me a more expanded version. And so 2 days came by, and they called me up. I'm like, I don't have ton more. It's only been, 48 hours. So I pitched him a little more. He liked that. And he's like, expand it more. And we went through this whole process for, a couple of weeks. And finally my agents were like, look, if you like it, give him the job. And he's like, okay. And so,
but you were not, when you went in and read the script, were you familiar? Like, I'm not familiar. I mean, I've heard of the movie, but I've never seen it. So were you familiar with the movie enough that you could kind of get the gist of it from the script maybe, or?
No. Like, I'd never even seen the movie. Like, I've seen, the posters and, of Jane Fonda, et cetera, but I literally had never even seen the movie. And, the good thing was the script that they gave me sort of showed the direction you could go. So that sent my mind spinning in probably the right direction, because it was sort of the way they wanted to go. It just wasn't the way they wanted to do it. So I literally just approached it as sort of a, sci-fi female secret agent, and I went sort of in that direction. That's what they wanted. But yeah, I was completely winging it, because it, and there's not much. If you've seen, the movie, it's just sort of 60s crazy movie. There's not a lot of plot to it, so I'm not sure how much you could take from it anyway.
Yeah.
But.
So I'm curious. I'm always curious, just sort of on statistics. We've talked about some of the successes with getting these writing assignments. How many times, just roughly ballpark, how many times have you gone in and pitched and not gotten the job? What sort of ratio would you say you're at on this?
I'm probably 50%. But which is really good. But there's also been stretches. Like, there was one year where I came in second 3 straight times, which, that probably represented 7 months of my life, 6-7 months of my life of working all the story out, going through all the pitches, getting it narrowed down. So there was 7 months just completely wasted, where I was doing no writing. And that really sort of got me off the assignment game a little bit, where I'm like, and it's also frustrating if you're a writer and you're never able to actually write, you're just breaking stories. Like, that's the hard part. So all you're doing is the hard calculus part, and you're not doing any of the fun part. So that was a brutal 7 months. But all told, and another thing is, there's a big difference when someone is coming to you and saying, I think we want you for this job. We've got to go see a few other people because my boss wants me to, blah, 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 but we want you for this job. When that's happened, I've gotten a job 100% of the time. Because other times it's just, they like your writing, they're throwing your name in a hat just to sort of buffer up the numbers, and maybe they, just to sort of make it look good. I think 90% of the time they know who they want to hire.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about some of your spec scripts. I mean, it sounds like you have, a very good ratio of being able to write a spec script and then actually sell a spec script. I wonder if maybe you could give us some tips on, how you come up with your concepts. And maybe to start, we could even talk about Scared Straight, Straight and Narrow, and Shadowrun. You could just give us like a pitch on those, and then maybe we could talk a little bit specifically how you came up with those concepts, and then maybe just some ideas about, in general, how do you come up with concepts. So let's start with Scared Straight.
Sure.
What's sort of the concept, and how did you come up with it?
Well, that one, I was just here. Well, in terms of specs, the good news is I've been able to go sort of 5 for 5, which sounds good, but there's been an ungodly amount of thought that went into each of them, and they've each taken a long time to do. And what I end up doing, and I'll sort of go quickly into Scared Straight, is I just am brutal with logline creation. So it's, probably to come up with Scared Straight, I probably went through 50 ideas, and it's coming up with log lines and ideas and worlds and all that sort of stuff, but basically the hook and the log line, and then I go through a giant filtering process where I pitch it to a bunch of friends, I pitch it to producers I know, I pitch it to anyone that'll listen, basically, and you can tell when something catches. But normally, at least for me, I'm not just a pure idea generator. So it's a lot of work for me. So it is going through 50 and getting one good one. And for Straight and Narrow, I think I went through 90 different ideas before because I had an agent and a manager.
You're saying just completely different ideas, and your pitch, and then you narrow it down. You say, this one I think actually has some legs, and I'll go with that.
Right. And a lot of times, because I have a manager and an agent, I'll pitch it to both of them. And so, like, with Straight and Narrow, which was after Scared Straight, I went through 80, but it was, and I had two agents and a manager. So 2 of them would like something, the other one wouldn't. And 1 of them would like something, the other 2 wouldn't. Like, went through that, and finally, when I got to the 80th one, they all liked it and were like, that's it. And that's sort of the brutal sort of front-end process that I go through.
And let's talk about that, though, for a minute. How long of a period is that? Like, how long does it take you to come up with 80 log lines? Is it over a month, 2 months, 3 months?
Yeah, probably 3 months, and it's dedicated because it's such a different, completely different skill set than writing. And in most cases, I find that if you stacked all my writer friends, 20 of them, say, and you put the best idea generators and the best writers, it's almost inverse. Like the best idea generators are normally in a sliding scale would be the worst writers, and the best writers would be the worst idea generators. So it's almost a completely different skill, at least from what I've seen. Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm not the best idea generator. It's a brutal sort of sitting in a room, just pounding the wall and pulling hair out and just going through the internet and trying to find touchstones. And like for me with Scared Straight, it was the Scared Straight program. Like, I'd seen a rerun of that documentary, that 70s documentary, and it scared the crap out of me when I was a kid. So that nugget was always in my brain of that Scared Straight program, and I knew it was sort of a touchstone and a thing that could be the basis of something. So that one, just to get into that, is I originally thought that, just for people who don't know, Scared Straight program is when they take juvenile delinquents that they can't get to stop committing crimes and put them in a really horrible jail for a day and have like inmates scream at them and tell them what they do to them if they were in jail, blah, blah, blah. And at the time in the 70s, it had like a 85% success rate of these kids just being scared to death and never doing crime again. But anyway, so my initial thought was not Scared Straight. It was just sort of prison, and I was going to have a guy in jail on a conjugal visit when the prison's overtaken, and it's about getting his wife out. But then that Scared Straight nugget hit in my head, and I thought, well, what if the Scared Straight program was going on, and that the prison was overtaken, and it was about a prisoner teaming up with one of the kids that gets loose, and it's sort of about not only about getting the kid out, but foiling the bigger, larger bad guy plan, and it just sort of took off from there. I was able to sort of marry the nugget that was floating in my head with a sort of log line I had about the prison thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think, yeah. So, let's talk about Straight and Narrow. What's the log line on that?
That one, it's been a while. It's basically about an ex-con that gets out and is trying to go straight and meets a female parole officer, and her father never wants them to get married, hates the idea of an ex-con, blah, 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 until he gets into trouble of his own, and the only guy he can turn to is the ex-con. So he needs the ex-con as sort of his bad skills to solve something. So it's sort of a circle where, the father, the guy's helping the father while trying to keep the wife or the fiancée from not finding out because he's promised her he's gone straight. And it's sort of an action romantic comedy, basically.
And where do you think that idea kind of came from?
That was a really tough one because I honestly went through at least 80, and I think it was, there wasn't any sort of eureka moment. I think it was just a sitting down and coming up with little bits and pieces, and somehow it flew out of my brain. I don't really have a great backstory for it, other than I sort of wanted to do something a little bit comedic at the time because Scared Straight was sort of a dark genre thing. And so, I don't know how exactly I came up with it, but I know that when I sort of pitched it to them at the time, and I think Mr. and Mrs. Smith had just come out, so they were sort of in that mindset. I'm not sure why, but everyone sort of seemed to like it, and so I went off and wrote it.
Do you ever feel like, or do you ever get into an idea like, okay, so there's a process of coming up with just dozens of log lines, then you start to develop some material. Do you ever get to the point where maybe you have like an outline and you realize it's not working and you abandon it and go back to the drawing board? Or by the time you feel like you've decided on a log line that's solid, you know you can get it all the way through to the script stage?
No, I mean, that has happened to me a couple of times, and there have been a lot of abandoned things, actually, where I just couldn't crack it. And this sort of dovetails into Shadowrun, because I had an idea about a prisoner exchange. I knew there was something there, and I tried to crack it a bunch of times, where sort of my idea was, you know, two guys are on a prisoner exchange, one from one country, one from the other, and as they're being exchanged, you know, they're both an attempt's made on both their lives. So they then have to work together to go figure out what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And I could never make that work. And then I was just sitting with a buddy of mine who ended up becoming a producer on the film, a guy named Hernani Perla. And he sort of put it through a different prism where he's like, what if it's all about getting them to the prisoner exchange? Like, that's not the turning point, that's the finale, or that's the goal. And for some reason, that completely jarred me out of the sort of, you know, road that I was stuck on creatively. And gosh, I think in that coffee session, we beat out like the majority of the beats. Like, it just completely, it was like a deluge after that. Like, it just completely flowed for me once I was able to sort of twist it.
One thing I just want to touch on here, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I want to hear it from you, and I'm just really playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
But a lot of writers that I get, especially the newer writers, they're so afraid someone's going to steal their idea. And you are out there. You just said, "Oh, I come up with these log lines. I'll pitch them to anybody who will listen." Just give us your take on that. You're not afraid that people are going to steal these brilliant ideas you're coming up with, I take it.
No, I mean, unless, you know, first of all, the truly brilliant once-in-a-lifetimes rarely come along. 90% of them are going to be at least a little bit execution dependent. So if I came up with Jurassic Park, or if I came up with some, like, genius thing, maybe I would censor it a little bit more. But even that, like, the chances of someone just going to run off and write a script, it's not like you can just sell a log line. If it were that, then I would be much more terrified. But the idea of someone actually being able to write the script is a whole, you know, that's not just something you just go off and do. So I'm less worried about it. And also, you know, I trust, maybe I'm more trusting in, you know, my writer friends. I would kill them in their sleep if they ever did that. But, and yeah, I don't worry about it. I don't worry about showing people my stuff, even when it's rough. Like, I've never been, I don't know, I've always viewed that, especially the script part, as it's a broken car. And if someone can show me how to fix it or has an idea to fix it, I'm there. Like, I don't care that they think I have a broken car, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So as you move along in your career, is there anything that surprises you from, you know, that guy working at the Sears, you know, fantasizing about, I'm going to be a professional screenwriter? Is there anything that kind of surprises you about now that you are a professional screenwriter?
Just, you know, in a weird way, just that a lot of the stuff you hear or you heard or I heard about Hollywood is actually true. There is a very much I have a buddy of mine that calls it bullshit heat, which is something happens in your career where you're hot. It's a spec sale. Something happens, and it really does have a tangible effect on everyone in town, in a weird way. Like, you know, they'll say yes to stuff they wouldn't say yes to before. They would trust you when they wouldn't trust you again. They would get involved with you when they never would again. It's a weird, that part of it is very, very true, which I just figured, people are not going to care about that. It's all meritocracy. And you know, it's not always that way. It really is sort of, you know, it's a popularity game at times. You know, if you have a great script, you know, I think it'll always find its way. But there's there's all the political stuff, all the, all that kind of stuff that you sort of hear about. A lot of it is strangely true.
Mm-hmm. Is there any frustration on your part about, working on a lot of projects and not actually seeing them get into production?
Yes, it's the bane of my existence. I've had stuff made that I didn't get credit on, and that's sort of brutal. And that's literally all my focus right now is I won't write anything now that's a big world building, $200 million, movie, which I wrote a lot of those. I won't do that anymore because they make 2 of them a year and half of them are going to be from Marvel. There's just no way to get those movies made. The thing that I'm concentrating on now is, a ground, because there's 2 subjective things in my view, that can sort of hurt you or sort of block your road, which is, humor and anything heightened. This is just all my opinion. So, in the way I'm viewing my career, which is, I don't want to write anything that involves humor again because that's so subjective. And I've had things stall or run into roadblocks because the person reading it didn't get the humor. So don't want to do any of that anymore. And then the other thing is any sort of heightened concept is something people can poke a lot of holes in that can also stall you too. So what I'm concentrating on is grounded stuff in the action thriller genre and something at a reasonable budget, something in that $60 to $80 million range where if you get a good star, if you get a Denzel, if you get a Liam Neeson, whoever it is, a Mark Wahlberg, the chances are going to be really good you're going to get it made. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to hit that sweet spot for solely that reason that, if I'm living in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills 20 years from now and I've never had a movie made, I think I would view that as a failure. So
yeah. So Shadowrun sounds kind of big budget. The way you're describing it sounds like Scared Straight is exactly the kind of movie you're trying to write again.
Yeah, although Shadowrun, the way I wrote it, you'd be surprised. It's in that sort of safe house, contraband budget range.
Okay.
It definitely can be done. I think that's one. You get the right director, you get a good cast, and it has a really good chance of getting made. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of where I'm focused now is in that area.
Let's talk a bit about your novel. I know you just completed a novel. Maybe you can kind of give us the pitch on that and maybe give us a little background as to why you decided to write a novel.
Yeah, well, that's easy because what I did is I ended up turning Scared Straight into a novel.
Okay.
And that was one, again, I've always sort of loved that story, and I was able to get, the rights back. So I always wanted to write a novel, and I figured I've pretty much got the main story worked out. It would just be about blowing it out a bit. And I also thought that the book might rekindle interest, in the script too. So it's sort of calculated in that way. Mm-hmm. But I retitled, it's called Uncaged. It's on Amazon. And yeah, I really wanted to write a novel and I always loved that story. So I thought I wanted to write something that was just a burning page turner, something to be, I wasn't trying to write War and Peace. I wanted something that was just pure sort of entertainment and thrills. So, is
it self-published?
No, it's through a publisher called Zova. And it's weird. They were the first publisher I met with, and I sort of fell in love with the editor, who was this woman that, I just really clicked with her. And so it's a small publisher. They have a different business model in that they're trying to get involved with screenwriters. So what you do is I split profits with them 50-50, but I get no advance, and they get 20% of the deal if I sell it as a set it up as a project. Uh-huh. So they're sort of betting on the back end. We're both sort of betting on me, basically. Mm-hmm. I'm betting on myself that hopefully, it can sell some copies, and otherwise, I don't get paid. But again, I thought it was sort of I just really loved the editor. I thought it was sort of a cool business model, and I just dug it.
So you mentioned at the top of the podcast that you were reading some of these books and you were just getting sort of nuggets from working screenwriters and inspiration. I wonder if there's, anything you can say to, some inspiration or words of encouragement to the aspiring screenwriters that maybe are listening to this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is, and I actually talked to Aaron Sorkin one time, and he said, it was a group of us, and he said, the good news is it's going to sound horrible, but the good news is there's a ton of horrible writers out there. And they're sort of mucking up the process. There's sort of, there's this mass of them, but if you have a good screenplay, people are going to spark to it so heavily that it's going to find its way always. So if you write a really good script, I think you're in really good shape. Even today, I know specs are harder and, pre-existing properties and IPs and all that, but I've found that if you have a good original idea and a good screenplay, people freak out over it. They're desperate for that. Yeah. So I think in that respect, you can still break in with a good script pretty easy.
Mm-hmm. So what's the best way for people to keep up with you and potentially contact you? Do you have Twitter? You can maybe mention your website.
Yeah, I mean, I have joegazzam.com. Okay. And then, really just sort of Amazon for the book. And then I'm not doing any Twitter, not doing a ton of social media. So, just those two things.
Perfect. I will link to your website and to the book on Amazon in the show notes. So if anybody's listening to this, they can find the show notes and click on over. Well, Joe, you've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate your coming on. This has been a great interview. Lots of good nuggets of information.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Just a quick plug for my email and fax blast query service. Just in the last year, I've optioned 4 scripts, sold 1 script, and gotten 1 paid writing assignment. And all this came from using my own email and fax blast service. Here's how it works. First, you join SYS Select. Then you post your logline and query letter in the SYS Select forum. I review your logline and query letter and help you make them as good as they can be. Then you purchase the blast and I send it out for you. The emails are all sent from your email address, so all replies go back directly to you. You can exclude companies if there are specific companies you don't want to send to. Check out www.sellingyourscreenplayselect.com to learn more. Once again, I want to thank Screencraft for sponsoring this episode. They're currently accepting submissions for their comedy screenplay contest. They have a great lineup of judges, some of the best comedy producers in the business. The deadline for entry is August 1st, so check out screencraft.org if you have a comedy screenplay you'd like to enter. If you're listening to this after the August 1st deadline, don't worry. They run different genre contests all the time, and we'll be doing another comedy contest next year. So do check out the site and see what their latest offerings are. In the next episode of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Joe Tucci. He's the founder of The Happy Writers, which was recently bought by Stage 32. They offer a variety of services to screenwriters, including an online pitch session to executives. So he's got some great tips about how to pitch your screenplay. So keep an eye out for that episode next week. So in this week's Writing Words section, I want to talk a bit about what Joe just mentioned in terms of how he develops ideas. The first SYS Select class that I did, which was recorded and is actually still available to SYS Select members, was about choosing a marketable concept. Really listen to what Joe just said. He thinks in a lot of cases, the person who ultimately decides to buy a spec script or not probably hasn't even read the script. And so what is that person using to decide if she should buy the script or not? They're really looking at the concept. It's the development executive who most likely has read the script, pitching it to them. So the concept has got to be rock solid so that the development executive can pitch it to the person who actually makes the decision. I'm really impressed, too, with what Joe said, that the way he comes up with 80 or 90 concepts and log lines before he lands on one that he likes. That's a lot of work, but that's the sort of work that a professional screenwriter must do. As I mentioned, I'm finishing up my most recent spec script and starting to try and come up with log lines for the next script that I write. I'm building a library of log lines and will hopefully have some good ones when I hit 100. I'm just really inspired by what Joe said and going to really try and push harder, at least for myself, in this direction, spending a lot more time on trying to come up with marketable concepts. One thing I've noticed, I've been trying to come up with one log line per day. And when you put that sort of pressure on yourself, everything you see or read about, you start to frame it in the context of what the log line would look like. So it seems to get easier after really doing it for a few days. I definitely feel like you can get better at this. I've never really felt like I was good at coming up with high concept premises, but I do feel like I'm getting better by pushing myself. I also really like his tip, taking something exciting and contained, like a prison riot, and then combine it with something that we've all heard about, like Scared Straight, to come up with a really fresh, high concept idea. I've been trying to utilize that with all these log lines that I've been coming up to. So that's a great tip that I got, and hopefully you guys will find it useful too. Anyways, that's our show. Thanks for listening.